Hello and welcome to VHTB, your guide to talent, culture, and the finance side of the space startup ecosystem. My name is Justus Kilian. I'm a partner at Space Capital, and today I'm joined by my co-host, Matt Gjertsen from Better Everyday Studio. How are you, Matt?
I'm doing great. Hello.
And Seyka Mejeur at AdAstra Talent Advisors. Hey, Seyka.
Hey.
Well, great. Today I want to dive into a question around, being young and scrappy versus more experienced and having sort of a seasoned track record of execution, and how that shows up not only at the founder level, but at the manager level, and how you think about that trade-off in recruiting. And so I speak to, a ton of brilliant young individuals. They're evaluating their next step following academics. Many of them, are set on starting their own company or joining a startup. They see it as the highest return on their skills or what they've currently learned, the ability to get their hands involved in a lot of different areas. But often I recommend to them that they really should consider starting to work for larger organizations like SpaceX, Amazon, before they join some sort of early stage company. And sort of my rationale here is that when you're coming out of undergraduate and you're just starting to get some exposure, startups often don't have a lot of the resources necessary to help you sort of build even like basic business skills, communication skills. They don't have the process and systems to help you see how work is done at scale. And so by joining one of these larger organizations, you could start to build some sort of frame of reference or pattern recognition around what's quality versus not and how best practices are done. And so as opposed to joining startups right out of the gate. So I just wanted to start out with you guys, offering this question to both of you. What have been your observations working with scrappy founders, those young founders, versus more experienced folks in your respective roles?
You want to go first, Seyka?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting to talk about founders specifically. Is that primarily your question, is like looking at founders that haven't had the experience, or even like, other people joining scrappy startups?
So I was going to start with founders and just like, as your professional services and the way that you've engaged with these organizations, like what have you seen that dynamic look like? Is it, have you experienced something different, directly working with those organizations as a result of, young or more seasoned?
Yeah.
But we can go to candidates if you prefer.
No, I think they're both really interesting to talk about. When it comes to founders, I'd say a common theme that we find with very early career founders that haven't had the experience that you're talking about, there's some wisdom lacking. Sometimes the expectations, they've got a sharp pinpoint on a goal that they want to hit, and they want to get through with force and muscle and lose some of the wisdom of nuance and the ability to reach that goal in the most conducive way to building a team and actually achieving those goals. So we'll see more force, muscle. What were some of the words that you were using? You said
tenacity.
Right? Raw hunger and tenacity is involved, and we see some of the wisdom that can be lost there when it comes to founders. I couldn't agree more with some of the things that you're saying. I love that your recommendation for them was to first take a role at a SpaceX or an Amazon. I am noting that you weren't saying a Boeing or a Raytheon. I think that not that there can't be a path through those companies, but I do think that many people consider those kind of like anti-credits on a resume, and that needs to be taken into consideration.
Have you had to change your work style, when there is that greater urgency, that greater drive, to be able to deliver and, help secure the best candidates?
Yes, and we have just opted out sometimes. Yeah. I'll give an example. Founder contacted us, a college dropout, great college dropout, was founding their company. They were saying that they specifically wanted talent in LA, 7 to 11 years of experience from SpaceX. They said the culture was sleeping under their desks. They're 24/7, like hard pressed to the line because their goals are so important. And they are targeting $150 cash compensation for these people. And the first thing I'm talking them through is if you're looking for that many years of experience, let's do some quick math to calculate what life stage many of these people are going to be in. The cash compensation is far too low for what these people are able to get out in the market from similar startups. And the design of this is not going to be appealing. Now, can we find someone? Sure, but this is not a setup to achieve your goals. And they just wanted to make it happen. It was, if there's a will, there's a way, which I appreciate because I have raw tenacity and I love muscling the impossible. So it resonates with me. And at the same time, I go, there's a wiser way to approach this. And I know that because I've run into enough walls and beat myself to a pulp enough times that I've seen it. And I'd love to be able to transfer that wisdom. But if you're not open to that insight, this isn't going to be a great fit. Does that answer your question?
It does. And I think there's a lot of important lessons there that people could sort of take around that balance and how you've thought about navigating that situation. I'd love to flip it over to you. You know, you've worked with a ton of great companies and founders. I'm curious what you see, or if you do see. I mean, maybe this is a loaded question, and tell me if I'm wrong.
No, I don't think it's a loaded question at all. And I think, especially in the founder spot specifically, I think the most common kind of blind spot that can occur when you're doing, like fresh out of university, like I'm going to go to start a company, is a true realization of just how hard it is to get people to work together, how hard it is to get people rowing in the same direction. If you think about it, when you think about your early life of like who you hang out with in school, which school you go to, very often you're just naturally going to be choosing like the lowest friction route through life. And so you're hanging around with people who all believe the same thing. You have similar interests. It's really easy to talk to one another. It's really easy to get along. And then as soon as you start a business and if you want to hire the right people and you're focused on the talent needs, 100%, you are suddenly going to get people who don't have the same interests as you, who have a different lifestyle setup. And you've never had to figure out how to relate to these people because that's just not really how life often works when you're younger. And so then I think it's interesting where I can really sense in a lot of organizations, especially early stage, I'm usually working with kind of the HR departments within organizations, and I find it really interesting who they choose to hire into HR. And if it's somebody, a new founder who hires an extremely experienced HR person, I'm usually like, okay, that's interesting because that's a young founder who like realizes a potential blind spot in their experience. And so they hired somebody specifically to help them with that blind spot. And that's amazing. But it is often a blind spot that comes up.
Often it's the other way around, that people discount the value of talent in HR until way too late.
Yes, exactly right. And then you have all these challenges because what will happen is all of a sudden you'll be several years in, several funding rounds in, and you're like, wait, we just hired all these people. Why aren't we hitting our milestones? What's going on? Why isn't productivity increasing? And it's because you're having lots of friction in between people and you're starting to have turnover because people don't like that friction. It takes, an organization needs to get to a certain critical mass before the people side friction really starts to dominate and cause a problem. And so to your point, if you've never been at an organization of that size, it's maybe just something you've never seen before. And so you don't know to expect it.
I had a first-time founder that very early on was kind of running through what he wanted to tackle first hires and kept saying, well, HR is just a hammer. HR is just a hammer. And I was like, hold on. I need to understand what you're saying here. What do you mean? What do you mean by that? And he said, well, it's just, it's just the same. It's just a tool and they just do the same thing. So it doesn't really matter who you put in there. And I was like, let's back way up, right? And it's kind of the opposite on that scale that you were just talking about.
Yeah, exactly right. And it's something that, it definitely gets reinforced in the culture as well. And there's plenty of companies that do it really poorly as well. So there's every reason to see that. But I think, that's probably the most common experience side things, because I do think there are instances where, very young people can be excellent leaders despite not having technical experience, and then vice versa. So,
I mean, that's a natural transition. I wanted to go there next. Matt, you developing managers and leaders within these organizations, well, does your approach differ when you're working with folks that have, sort of limited on-the-job experience? And can they develop and accelerate their career trajectory into manager and more leadership roles, being younger and having less experience?
Yeah, I definitely think they can. I think a lot of it depends on, past experience is in life. But I think the most important thing, in your question, one of the things I'm hearing is that, kind of the way you have to adapt, the way HR, the way training needs to adapt to a lot of technical individuals is just realizing that there's less. You can't assume anything. You can't assume that people are going to think this is important. You can't assume people know what you're talking about when you say something like psychological safety. And so it's engaging them in a discussion of getting them to think about their experiences in life, of why they have worked well in certain circumstances and not circumstances. Obviously, often it's just a matter of getting them to have some of that reflection that maybe will happen eventually in your career, but hasn't happened yet. And so I think the change is pushing people into that reflection and not assuming that they've experienced certain things. But it definitely can happen, but it's rare. I would say that when you have that less experience, that you're just going to be ready to go.
Do you change your approach when you're going into companies? I don't know. Do you often, when you're working with, managers, and if they are younger, would you change your approach in terms of engagement?
A little bit, but not a ton. I mean, I tend to focus on earlier managers anyway, like newer managers anyway. And so the focus doesn't have to change a lot because I find that it works really well. Like what works well with new managers of really focusing on the basics of the impact that this is going to have on the company, the basic behaviors that they need to have. It can work really well with technical leaders who are at higher levels, who still care about those fundamentals of what the impact is going to be on the business. I do think there's a difference between, working with technical companies and non-technical companies, or working certainly for talking to an HR audience versus a non-HR audience. I definitely talk a lot different there, but I don't know if there's a huge difference, like people who have had experience versus haven't had experience, other than just how much reflection I try to push them on.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So Seyka, I'd love to get your take going through the recruiting process for a variety of roles. How do you sort of make that trade between, highly motivated, very energetic, maybe somebody coming from outside the industry but doesn't have the skills, or somebody coming right out of university? And how do you compare them to a candidate that has a little bit more skills, like very specialized in the domain and has that pattern recognition? What are you telling to the HR manager, the hiring manager, when you have these contrasting candidates?
Yeah, it's such a great point. So one thing that I think is just a fun illustration is with founders, I want to see this Venn diagram of IQ, energy, and integrity. And if you can kind of play with it in your mind, you're like, hey, if I have 2 and not 1, what problem comes up? And it's like very clear, right? So you could do something similar, but instead of putting in IQ, let's call it experience, right? If you have somebody with high energy and low experience at a company that doesn't have a lot of guardrails, you can have somebody making a lot of mistakes with a lot of energy, which is a compounding issue. So here are some of the, I'm one that says there are almost no requirements. They're almost all trades, right? And so I leads to a lot of not straight answers, but pros and cons. We're always looking at pros and cons, and we can advise which path makes the most sense. So are there strong mentors at the company who are going to have the capacity to guide somebody who is on the newer side? If so, that gives us a lot more range to go into that high energy, high tenacity. They're going to, beat things in with their muscle. And that's really, really valuable. Mistakes are value. So this is a note that I love to put in for people who are interviewing and who get really anxious when somebody's going to ask them what's one of the biggest mistakes you've made, and they're going to try to pull up something that isn't really a mistake so that they can kind of pass the question without talking to it directly. And just to say, your mistakes are valuable. They are teaching you something as long as you are able to lower your defenses enough to really learn from those mistakes. So give real answers there, because people want to hear about the mistakes you've made and they actually are adding to your wisdom. It's also really important to weigh in how much scarcity there is for this skill set. So there are times where there is a really limited number of people who are able to do this technical project, right? Whatever needs to be accomplished technically, really limited group of people. So your options are to wait until you can get someone who's really seasoned in doing it, or have somebody who is skilled enough to be a mentor to a more entry-level person and get that person now. Now, are they going to be able to, be more accomplished and more able to handle things on their own by the time you would have to wait to hire somebody with more experience, right? So that's a factor to take into play. For candidates who are going, I want to jump straight into a startup. I'm going to have all this upward mobility. I'm going to be able to wrap my arms around a bunch of work. I've got all this energy and all this muscle, and I just want to be marching toward those goals. How do I do that? Because I have to have the space to make mistakes. I encourage people who are early enough that this advice can be useful, like get those internships while you're in school, where you're actually getting to have your hands on the technology. You're getting to gain the wisdom of how do these systems work? Matt, to your point, how do I get people rowing the boat in the same direction, and really use that time to be eyes wide open, consuming as much as you can about how businesses work? Because I know to someone who hasn't been in the seat getting people rowing together, it can seem like we just have a great goal, get the right people in a room, and they'll do it. And once you go through it a while, you realize how much more complex it is than that.
Just based on your answer, the thing that sparked in my mind, both at the founder level, the organization level, the employee level, it's kind of like a contrast of experience and self-awareness. Like you can have low experience, but if you have high self-awareness that you have low experience, that can be okay, because then you're wide open, you're looking for mentors, you're looking for other stuff. Same at the organizational level. If the organization knows that they're hiring people with low experience, but they have the guardrails in place because of X, Y, or Z, then it can be okay. But it's really like contrasting those two levels.
I think that's 100% right. And that's a great synthesis. I mean, we see the exact same thing at the founder level. I don't have hard numbers on this, but it feels like there are more young founders coming out of university than there ever has been. And maybe it's just more of a known career path. Maybe there's more dollars available. Maybe there's a higher risk tolerance. But in my, decade plus of, focusing on, venture investing, the board has to come in and help that CEO develop over time. There has to be multiple advisors that help mature that individual over time. There has to be an openness and awareness to listen and learn and take feedback. And so it does seem like there's this consistent pattern of the ability to reflect and then use that reflection to communicate and motivate over time. And it translates to, the entry-level jobs, the managers, all the way up to the CEO. Those are the things that you're building through experience. And, if you have the space and the ability to trade that off and allow people to build that on the job, great. I still think it's somewhat hard to do in a startup that's inherently resource constrained and, there's a real urgency around everything that you're doing. So it just leads back to that original recommendation of, if you're starting out, maybe SpaceX or Amazon isn't a bad place to sort of learn some of those things.
It goes back to exactly what Seyka said, like mistakes are valuable. Go someplace where you can make mistakes.
Yep.
Because sometimes in startups, you almost just can't because they don't have the runway.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. Well, that's a great way to wrap it up. Thank you both for your perspective. This was really great. Appreciate it.